Good evening and welcome to the Faith and Sports Forum on Mental Health. My name is Elizabeth Bounds and I have the privilege of being tonight's hostess and offering all introductions. I serve as the Assistant Administrator of Online Programming and High School Retreat Director for the Faith and Sports Institute. To set the stage for this evening, it's worth noting that the Faith and Sports Institute as a whole is a team of athletes, coaches, scholars, and chaplains who are passionate about providing education, training, and resources at the intersection of Christianity and sports. And one way that we execute that mission is through virtual forums, just like the one that you're watching right now, in which we invite experts to share insights on critical issues relevant to the sports world. Our conversation tonight will take place at the intersection of faith, sports, and mental health. Tonight, we have the privilege of hearing from two remarkable human beings and mental health experts. At this time, I'll invite Doctors Monique Marsh-Bell and John Swinton to turn their cameras on while I make their introductions. Our first speaker this evening will be Dr. Monique Marsh-Bell. She serves as the Assistant Athletic Director for Mental Health Services here at Baylor University. Dr. Marsh-Bell's clinical and advocacy work centers on the prevention, education, and treatment of mental health issues, in specific with vulnerable and marginalized populations or people who underutilize mental health services. Dr. Marsh-Bell provides mental health resources to student athletes and Baylor University's athletic department at large. And she does this via individual therapy, mental health education, crisis intervention, and referral services. Dr. Marsh-Bell is a real asset to Baylor athletics, and the work that she does to serve and lead is admirable and important. We're grateful to have her and hear her on the ground clinician's perspective this evening. Our second speaker this evening is Dr. John Swinton. Dr. Swinton holds the chair in Divinity and Religious Studies at King's College, the University of Aberdeen. Dr. Swinton worked as a registered mental health nurse for 16 years, as well as a mental health hospital chaplain. His background in nursing, ministry, healthcare chaplaincy laid the foundation for his teaching and research in practical theology, pastoral care, counseling, mental health studies, and disability theology. Dr. Swinton is also an ordained minister in the Church of Scotland and has authored several books at the intersection of theology, spirituality, and mental health. And at some point this evening, we'll post a link in our chat box to his most recent book, published with Erdman's, entitled Finding Jesus in the Storm, The Spiritual Lives of People with Mental Health Challenges. We're grateful to have Dr. Swinton join us and are eager to hear his theological perspective of mental health challenges. After we hear from both speakers, we will engage in a question and answer session with both Doctors Marsh-Bell and Swinton, moderated by the co-founders of the Faith and Sports Institute, Dr. John and Cindy White. So as you're listening, if you have any questions for our speakers, please feel free to submit those to the Q&A feature of Zoom towards the bottom of your screen, and we will answer as many as time allows. Feel free also to utilize the chat box, as we will be posting resources along the way. Now, it is with excitement that I turn the screen and the stage over to Dr. Marsh-Bell.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. I'm so happy to be here. Always excited to talk about mental health. So just thinking about athletes in general, they are athletes for a reason. They have an ultimate goal and desire for most of them to be the GOAT. They want to be the greatest of all time. They want to be a part of this picture of the greatest of all time in a variety of sports. Back in the day, they might have wanted to be on the Wheaties box when that was a big thing. If you were the greatest, that was an accomplishment, or on the cover of sports magazines. They work really hard for these accomplishments. The time and effort that they're putting in is for ultimate goals, Olympic champions, national championships. This is a part of what they want as athletes. And so when you think about the greatest of all time, and maybe if you want to jot down in the chat, what do these people have in common? What do the greatest of all time, what are those characteristics that they share that makes them or qualifies them to be the greatest of all time? Let's see, we got a couple of people. Resilience, number one thing. Thank you. Perseverance, commitment, love that. Determination. You all are doing my next slide for me. Physical ability and skill. Yeah. So all of those things, passion, thank you. All of those things are typical of what you hear and what you see when you think about the greatest of all time. They're focused on their sport, they're determined, they're motivated, they're resilient. When things get really tough, they can remain in control. They have a natural skill or a honed skill. Maybe it wasn't natural, their ability that they've been working on. They are resilient. We hear that all the time, that they're able to push through regardless of what happens and overcome all types of adversities. This is what we know from the GOATs, the greatest of all time. What athletes start to hear from a very young age is these things that will help them become the GOAT. Sometimes it's encapsulated in the definition of mental toughness. Almost every athlete that I've talked to said, yeah, this is something that coaches from a very early age kind of pound into them, that you want to be mentally tough. So some of those same things, you want to be focused, resilient, you want to push through, you want to remain positive no matter what's going on, you want to keep pushing towards your goal. And that's what you need in order to be the greatest of all time. And so this is what they start with from a very, very young age, because a lot of them start in T-ball and those like 3, 4-year-old, 5-year-olds who are starting sports. So they've spent a lot of time hearing the same narrative of what they need to do and be in order to be the greatest. So when you take this definition of mental toughness and the things that were on the last slide, those characteristics of greatest of all times, and you compare them and match them to what it means to have a mental illness, those things are in direct conflict, right? Because when we know about people who have mental illnesses, some of the symptoms that they experience are the direct opposite of what it means to be mentally tough or to be the greatest of all time. When we think about people with depression who are often fatigued or maybe lack motivation, people who have anxiety that maybe struggle with focus or feel that their mind and thoughts are racing so much that sometimes they might feel out of control. Those things are the opposite of what these athletes have been told their entire life that they need to be in order to be the greatest of all times. And so when an athlete is dealing with mental illness, just the acceptance of that to them sometimes means that I can't be what I'm striving to be and what I'm working so hard to be if I admit or if I do have a mental illness. And so it's an internal battle that they're having a lot of times about trying to get to this goal and be the best athlete they can be, but accepting and recognizing that they might also have a mental illness, and therefore it's a barrier to them seeking services. What we've also seen is that some of the risk and protective factors when it comes to mental illness are different among athletes. Some are the same for athletes in the regular population, but there's some that are actually quite different. And I'll go into some of these a little more in the next couple of slides, but just to touch base on a few of them. Illness and injury. The likelihood of me getting injured walking from my car to the building, up to my office, doing therapy all day, back downstairs and out to my car is very low. Like that probability is very low. But when you think about a football player and the contact that they're having, and a cross-country athlete and the fact that they're running several miles every day, they're more likely to get injured. Injury and illness is a risk factor of mental health. Stress. I particularly work with college students, so student athletes. When you think about the stress of a regular student who doesn't have the extra responsibility of being an athlete, that in itself sometimes is enough for them to experience anxiety or depression. So you add that to 20 plus hours of athletic training and competition and workouts and team meetings, it's a lot that they're handling, especially at this age. For our younger high school students, just being a teenager in itself is stressful enough, but then we add the pressure of being an athlete on top of that. Significant life changes or losses. There's a great documentary called Weight of Gold, and it's about mental health among Olympic athletes. And they talk about how you trained for 4 years, you put everything you have into training for the Olympics for 4 years. And then if you get there and you don't medal, it's a huge loss. They feel like I've wasted 4 years because I did all of this work, got to the competition, and didn't even medal. And so they're more likely to have some of these even day-to-day losses as they're playing in tournaments and competitions. It hits them really hard as athletes. There are protective factors that are actually really helpful and more helpful because athletes are typically more physically fit and healthy. So because they're working out, because they are having those endorphins, they are happier. Physically fit people tend to recover quicker when there's injury. So there's some offset there. The other thing on that side is the social support. That can be a pro and a con for our athletes. And I'll talk more about that. And then resiliency, like I showed in the last slide, that idea of mental toughness, sometimes that type of resiliency can actually be a pro or a con, depending on how our athletes see that. So sometimes athletes have different risk and protective factors just because of their identity as an athlete. One of the things that really stands out for most people when they think about athletes and mental health is injury. They're more likely to be injured, and injury is more likely to result in anxiety, depression, substance abuse, and eating disorders, which a lot of people don't see that connection, but I'll speak about that. I've talked with so many athletes that talk about sitting on the sidelines when they're injured and watching their teammates win, watching their starting position be taken from them because they're not able to compete, watching their team get stronger and improve, and they're not able to do that, let alone just this idea of being outside of their team. I've heard athletes talk about how they feel that the coaches don't notice them anymore, or their parents aren't as proud of them anymore because they're not able to be successful in their sport in the time that they're injured. And so what does that create? That creates feelings of anxiety about whether or not they're going to be able to return. Is this injury going to be career ending? If they are returning, is their spot still going to be there? Are they going to be able to perform at the same level that they were before? It creates some feelings of depression, just sadness about being detached. The other thing is that it contributes to substance abuse. If you're having all these thoughts and worries, well, what takes that away for a little bit? A substance. It is a coping mechanism, even though negative. It does take away those feelings of anxiety or depression for a little while. And sometimes that just little while is what they're looking for, is just to have some relief from those symptoms that they're experiencing. The eating disorder piece comes into play because they're used to training at such a high level that they have to fuel at such a high level. And when they're not training at such a high level, sometimes they continue to fuel at that level, which means they're gaining some weight. And when they start to notice that, then they go in the opposite direction, which is that they're really restricting because they don't want to gain weight, they don't want to lose their muscle mass. And a lot of times, even when their injury, they're in the recovery process and their injury is no longer something that's restricting them for working out, they're still restricting their food intake. And then we're dealing with more eating concerns. So again, this is something more specific to our athletes. The social support piece, which was actually on the protective factor, can be either a protective factor or a risk factor for a student athlete, different than most people. They've done a lot of research about support, and what we've seen, like even in hospitals, the person that has the most visitors and getting the most cards and the most flowers, they heal quicker, they recover quicker. And so having that support system is really important. One thing that we see, that loneliness and isolation is a symptom of mental illness or effect of mental illness, that having social support can correct that very quickly. With student athletes, their social support is their team. It's their team, it's their coaches. For our younger athletes, it's their family. And so that's great because they kind of have a built-in social support system. But what happens if maybe you're not clicking as well with your teammates? For our college athlete, your teammates are also very often in the same classes with you and quite frequently your roommate. So you spend a lot of time with your teammates. What happens if that connection is not there? For some teams, they have to compete amongst themselves before they can even make it into the competition. So sometimes that can be a tough atmosphere for student athletes to be in. So sometimes, even though you have this built in support system, you feel really lonely as an athlete. And for a lot of our athletes, specifically our college athletes, they don't have a lot of extra time to go make other friends and provide themselves another support system. So for the regular college student, if they're in a friend group and they're not clicking with that friend group, or something happens and there's some conflict, they can go find another friend group. But our athletes, they don't get to leave their team and go somewhere else. So they really have to learn how to deal with that, and sometimes don't necessarily feel supported. Their relationship with parents and coaches, if that's a supportive relationship, that's good. If they feel like, if I don't do well, or if I'm struggling, I'm going to be looked down on, or my coach is not going to be proud of me or turn away from me, or my parents are not going to be proud of me, again, that could be a negative thing. And so it affects their support system. The loneliness, no other peers, like I said, sometimes they just don't have time to even go create those other social outlets. And so they feel a little stuck with their team at times. Um, Eating concerns and athletes have a higher risk of eating concerns. I talked about how it's connected to injury, but just in general, even outside of that connection, they're at greater risk than the general population. So think about our track athletes, our volleyball athletes, our gymnasts, swim, wrestling, and cheerleaders. Just aesthetically, they are in very revealing uniforms. And so for them, a lot of times it's a struggle because they, unlike people in other uniforms, can't even really hide the things that maybe they want to hide. They feel really exposed. I've talked with a lot of athletes that talk very negatively about their uniforms, not just because of how they feel about themselves, but the fact that they're seeing all their other teammates that maybe are more fit, or they feel like are more fit than they are. When you get to a higher level, because of how social media is now, you can also be really negatively critiqued by how you look. One sport that we have here at Baylor is the equestrian team. And one of the things that they're actually scored on is how they look on the horse. So your aesthetic and how you look really plays into even success in that sport. So they tend to, again, sometimes restrict, sometimes binge and purge, or trying to manage their weight in ways that are not healthy, or make a weight class in ways that aren't healthy. And so we see a higher prevalence of eating disorders. Post-injury eating disorder, I kind of explained that. We're seeing that around COVID now. When our athletes are in quarantine or isolation, they're doing the same thing. They can't work out, they can't compete. And so they're not eating as much, and they're restricting themselves. Social media, like I said, is a huge thing for our athletes because they can be critiqued about anything. And so even though eating disorders and how they look is one thing, how they look, but also just their performance. I have seen athletes have shared with me DMs that they've received from fans of the team that are so negative and hurtful and really just bullying. And so they're having to deal with that too, which also affects their self-esteem and therefore affects their mental health. Three quick things is common traits of athletes that also sometimes contribute to mental health issues. One is that our athletes tend to be more perfectionistic. They tend to be more of the perfectionist. Again, back to that idea of wanting to be the GOAT, wanting to be the greatest, always pushing really hard, setting really high expectations for themselves to be the best, to win the goal. And so in some ways that's great because that's their motivator, but sometimes they really get obsessed with this idea of being perfect. For some sports, there is a perfect when you think about it. Our acrobatics and tumbling team just won a national championship again. For them, they can get a perfect 10 on a pass. And so for some of them, when you can say, well, what is perfect in the sport? For our gymnasts, they can say, well, perfect is a perfect 10, and that's what they're striving for. And sometimes they get so hung up on that. The weight that they feel when they don't reach that is similar to some symptoms of depression. And really, they start to get down on themselves, start to question themselves, and really struggle with that. The other thing is being a people pleaser, which if you think about that, makes sense too for our athletes. So from a very young age, They're trying to please parents, they're trying to please coaches, they're trying to please spectators. Like if you think about being out in an athletic arena and you do something well and you look out and everyone's cheering for you, and then you do something not so well and you look out and you're getting a very different response, you're always trying to please those people. When it comes to coaches, you're trying to please them for another reason, because they have to be satisfied with your performance in order for you to even play. And so they tend to please people, or really strive to please people, which takes away sometimes from their ability to think about what makes them happy, what they want to do. Unfortunately, I have conversations with athletes that really don't want to participate in their sport anymore, but feel like they have to because they have to please other people, or for the reason of their identity. They feel like they are an athlete. So I work in the athletic department here at Baylor. All the students that I see are athletes. They know me, I know them. But when they come in for their first session and maybe I say something like, we've only talked the one time at practice, tell me a little bit about yourself. They tell me their name and they tell me what team they play for or what position they're in. And I'm like, I already know that stuff. But when you think about an athlete, that's how they see themselves. I'm Monique and I am a volleyball player at Baylor. It's right there. So they put so much on their identity that when they're injured, what happens? What we saw recently when COVID hit and you're not playing your sport anymore and you don't feel like I'm an athlete right now or in this moment, what happens? They start to experience a bit of identity crisis, in addition to having some mental health symptoms at times of anxiety of like, who am I? Are people going to like me? Are they going to be proud of me? Am I going to be able to be successful in anything if I'm not successful as an athlete? So we can see several ways in which athletes have a different experience when it comes to mental health. There's some different risk factors or characteristics that contribute to potentially them experiencing more mental illness, or just a different experience of mental illness. And so I'll stop there and I'll turn it over to Dr. Swinton to talk more about that.
Well, good evening, everybody. I'm going to try and share my screen before I kick off. There we go. Very good. So thank you, Monique. That was really, really interesting. And it's such a complicated thing, people's mental health. And if you've got a competitive environment like sport, then it becomes even more difficult and more complicated. My job this evening is to kind of give us a theological framework to think about some of the issues around sport, around competition, and around mental health. And so I want to begin by thinking about what we mean by mental health, or what we as Christians mean by mental health. So what do we mean when we talk about mental health? Then normally when we're thinking about mental health, we think about psychiatry or psychology and the mental health professions, all of which are really important. But the way in which the mental health professions frame mental health oftentimes is the absence of illness. So you either have mental illness or you don't have mental illness. And so to be healthy is to not have a particular form of mental illness. And that makes it difficult for people who live with long-term depression or long-term anxiety, because it feels like you're always ill. But when we turn to the Bible doesn't actually have a word for health in the way that we do within our biomedical kind of culture. The closest word the Bible has is the word shalom. Now, we all use the word shalom, or many of us do this, as a kind of greeting, as peace, but it's much deeper than that. So the term shalom means righteousness, holiness, and right relationship with God. And that's really interesting, because that means to be healthy biblically in that sense is not to necessarily not have illness or not have mental health challenges. To be healthy is to be in right relationship with God. And so you could be the fittest, most wonderful athlete that there is, and you could be really unhealthy, according to this understanding. But you could be somebody who's in a wheelchair or somebody who's at the end of your life and be really healthy. because health has to do not with the absence of something, but the presence of something, the presence of God. So I want you to hold on to that way of thinking about health and mental health as I move through. So thinking that in mind, keeping that in mind, what do we mean by sport? Well, I was thinking about this really, and one way we could think about sport is that it's soul work. It's something that we do with our souls, and I'll explain to you what I mean by that. So sport has to do with the movement of our bodies, but what exactly is our body, or what exactly is the relationship between our body and our soul? That's fascinating because sometimes many of us think that our soul is something that's completely disconnected from our body. But when we think about the way that the Hebrews thought about the body, you see something quite differently. You see it a lot in the Old Testament. You see it a lot in the New Testament. So Genesis 2:7, and the Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. A man becomes a living soul. So St. Augustine describes human beings as terra animata, animated earth. That's really important here because the Hebrews understood the body as body, mind, and soul inextricably interconnected. And here you see that picture. God blows God's spirit into the human being, and the human being becomes alive, but only because God sustains the human being in its life, but through God's own life force. So human beings are seen to be created from matters, inspired, given breath, brought into living existence by the very breath of God. So we are our bodies as we are our souls. Everything that we have, everything that we are, manifests something of God. It's something to do with being in God's image. We reflect something, and we live soulfully in that sense. If you think about that, and then think about this passage from Corinthians that Paul gives to us. He says, the only letter of recommendation we need is yourselves. Your lives are a letter written in our hearts. Everyone can read it and recognize our good work amongst you. Clearly, you are a letter from Christ showing the result of our ministry amongst you. This letter is written not with pen and ink, but with the Spirit of the living God. It's carved not on tablets of stone, but in human hearts. We are confident of all this because of our great trust in God through Christ. Think about it. We are who we are, body, mind, and soul. When people, and Paul says, when people look at us, when look at our bodies, look at what we do with our bodies, they need to see something of Jesus. So our bodies manifest something of whose we are, as well as who we are. So sport celebrates the beauty of the body. So if we're talking about theology, a theological understanding of the body, bodies are beautiful. Bodies are filled with God's Spirit. Bodies are brought into existence to reveal the beauty and the wonder of God. And that's all very important because there's something fantastic about watching sport and watching sportsmen and women move and glide and engage, because you see something of the glory of God when you begin to engage with people in that way. There's a beauty there. But we can get sucked into thinking that the only kind of body that is beautiful is one that looks beautiful according to the way that culture tells us beauty should be. But if this way of thinking about the human body is right, is correct, then all of our bodies are beautiful. Whether you're a great muscly athlete or whether you're a weak, puny guy like me, all of our bodies are beautiful. Let me just show you something that helps us to illustrate this. If I can get this to work properly. So you can begin to see that the wonder of sport is the wonder of the body, but the body itself is a beautiful place. So when we think about it in that way, sport becomes a celebration of the body. And if it's a celebration of the body, then it's a celebration of the soul. And if it's a celebration of the soul, then it's a celebration of God. And if it's a celebration of God, then sport is, in its most faithful forms, is a mode of worship. It's a way of giving God worth. It's a way of revealing something beautiful about God and human beings, in and through our competition, and then through our usage of our bodies. So that idea of sport as worship is important. Sport as witness. This is an old picture of Stephen Curry. He says, I try to use every game as an opportunity to witness, be a witness for Christ. When I step on the floor, people should know who I represent, who I believe in. So sport is witness, sport is worship. And that's really important. A sport is worship and witness that involves much more than just winning. It matters also how we lose. And so I wanted to think a little bit about a theology of disappointment and disillusionment. Because one of the things that we encounter very quickly when we engage with sport is that we need to learn how to be faithful in the way that we lose. We're disappointed by the way things are. So let's just think about that for a second. Disappointment and illusion. So this definition of disappointment is quite interesting. A feeling of disappointment is akin to depression, arising from the realization that something is not what it was expected or believed to be, possibly accompanied by philosophical angst from having one's beliefs challenged. So when you're disappointment, it's kind of like an existential crisis because things are not the way that you want them to be, they're not the way they're supposed to be. And that can be deeply damaging for your mental health if you're not careful, if you don't think about how you can deal with that. But I was speaking to a German guy the other day, and I was talking to him about disappointment. And he said, you know, in German, we have a different understanding of disappointment. And he said, the word in German, you have to forgive my pronunciations, and Enttäuschung. If anybody knows German out there, just laugh at me. But he says, to be disappointed is to be disillusioned. And to be disillusioned is to be freed from your illusions or deception. In other words, disappointment is not necessarily a time when you're just saying, well, I just give up. It actually can be a time when you see things differently, when you're free from illusions and free from deceptions. And I was thinking, what does that look like? I mean, what does that actually mean? And I began to think about the whole issue of joy. And I've done a little bit of work on joy recently. But I came across this passage, which some of you will be familiar with, in James. James says, dear brothers and sisters, when troubles of any kind come your way, consider it an opportunity for great joy. For you know that when your faith is tested, your endurance has a chance to grow. And I never understand what that means. How could possibly be disappointment, disillusionment, still enable a person to be joyful? How can you lose and be disappointed and still be joyful? And the answer is quite interesting. You know, we talk about the joy of sport, but what exactly is joy? So Paul puts it this way in Galatians 5:22. The fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness. So joy is something that's given to us by God. It's a gift of the Spirit. Joy is a gift. Joy is not synonymous with happiness. Interesting that Paul doesn't say there that the fruit of the Spirit is happiness. He says a fruit of the Spirit is joy, something different. Joy has durability. So happiness comes and goes. It's a fleeting emotion. One day you're happy, next day you're not. 1 minute you're happy, 1 minute you're not. But here Paul's talking about joy as being enduring. Even in the midst of disappointment and disillusionment, we find joy. And why is that? Well, the reason for that is because joy is Jesus. And you can see that all the way that Paul talks about that Jesus is our joy. That's the place where we find our sense of being in the world. That's the place where we find our sense of being healthy. That's the space where we find shalom. By recognizing that Jesus is our joy, we begin to see that even in the midst of disappointment, we find the possibility of joy. That is an enduring hope that even though things are not going well for me at this moment in time, Jesus remains with me. And Jesus will remain with me now and for all time. And that's where we find Christian hope. It's not determined by our success or by our happiness. It's determined by our relationship with Jesus. So we're not called to be happy. I mean, everybody likes to be happy, but we're called to be joyful. Now that means that joy incorporates sadness and brokenness, which takes us to the issue of lament. I don't know if you guys think a lot about the fact that, there's more Psalms of lament in the book of Psalms than any other kind of Psalm. And the Psalms of lament are really interesting because they cry out to God with disappointment, with brokenness, with lostness, but always in the context of prayer. And it's interesting the shape of the Psalm. So you get this big explosion of, no, it's not fair. This is a terrible thing that's happened to me. It almost feels like you've abandoned me, God. But then right in the middle of the Psalm, something changes. Like nothing changes. The disaster is still there. The terrible thing that's happened to the psalmist is still there. But suddenly he realizes God's hesed, God's ever-present love. And then he goes on to worship. Now, I think one way in which we can begin to have a practical theology of disappointment that enables us, even in the times when it's difficult, to hold on to our joy is by learning to lament. Read the lament Psalms. The next time you're disappointed, the next time you fall over, the next time you lose something that's really important to you, pick up the language of the Psalms and you'll find that whatever you're feeling is being articulated there, but always in prayer. And actually, some of the Psalms of lament are pretty vicious. They're talking about killing babies and God punishing people. But they're still prayers, they're still there. There's still ways in which we can articulate even our difficult feelings in a way that is faithful, in a way that enables us to be lost and disappointed, but even our lostness and our disappointedness, to hold on to Jesus. So just to finish, sport is worship. So developing a mentally healthy attitude would require this. If sport is worship, then winning and losing begin to look a little different. To be mentally healthy, we need to be able to find joy when we win and find joy when we lose. And that's a spiritual practice. That's something that we need to engage in over time. To find joy in times of sadness and disappointment, we need to learn how to lament, to be honest with God, to be honest with ourselves, but to recognize that God does not love us because of what we are, what we do, but just because he does. So lamenting helps us to hold on to Jesus even in difficult times. And holding on to Jesus in difficult times is the essence of faithful mental health. So we come back to the idea of shalom, that even when we're disappointed, even when we're struggling, even when we're battling long-term mental health challenges, that doesn't necessarily mean that we are abandoned by God. It simply means that as human beings, we get broken. The key thing that even in the midst of these difficult and deep and dark storms, we find ways, and other people help us to find ways to hold on to Jesus in order that we can have our one desire and we can find health even in the midst of ill health and really difficult times. So that's just one or two thoughts about what a theology of disappointment in sport might look like. So thank you for listening.
Thank you, John, and thank you, Monique. We are John and Cindy White here, and we're going to take time for asking and answering some questions. So that was great. I'll start out. Either of you feel free to jump in. Monique, you mentioned that if you're injured or suppose you're not playing well, you're on the bench far down, you're not noticed, or you're disappointing the coach or your parents. So how can coaches and parents help that sense of belonging and being noticed? What practices can they do so that they can feel there's a significant part of the team?
No, I think one big thing is talking to the athlete about more than the injury. So a lot of athletes say, you know, the coach does talk to me, or the conversations I feel like I have with all my teammates and everyone around me is, how's it going? How's recovery? How's rehab? When are you going to get back in there? And so for them, it puts a lot of focus on their injury and points out to them how important it is for them to be playing and not necessarily how important they are as a person, even though a lot of times we're asking those questions because we're concerned, you know, they're injured and we want to know how they're doing. So first of all, not always having the conversation tailored to focusing on the injury. And I think there are other things that a player can do when they're at practice instead of just sitting there. And, you know, sometimes and I've had this conversation, it's like, well, it feels like it's not enough. Like, I love that in acrobatics and tumbling, when some of them are injured, what they do is they're helping to record practice and do the playbacks and things like that. And so I talk about how you're helping your teammates get better in their practice. And because of that, your whole team is going to improve. And so just finding little ways that they can be active in the practice so they don't feel like they're just kind of the person standing off to the side.
That's good. So it gets you out of yourself a little bit when you serve others in that way. You're contributing somewhere.
Well, this has been a beautiful blend of psychology and theology. And as we think about just historically and even in the last 25, 30 years, that relationship between psychology and theology, Christians subscribe to different prescriptions. Some will say, no theology, I just need me and Jesus and the Spirit's power, right? Some may even say no therapy, some say no medication, or some combination of all those. So to either one of you or both of you, how do you sort through that relationship between psychology and theology? Because oftentimes it is seen as like oil and water.
Yeah, there's a couple of things that I would say on that. The first one is that it's more of a cultural thing to have a problem with your mind, because very few people have a problem going to the doctor for a broken leg or a damaged body. But many people do, Christians do have a bit of a struggle with when it comes to your mind. And I think that's because traditionally we kind of think that everything that is important about ourselves and our faith goes on in our heads. And so therefore, if you get something wrong with your head, there's something wrong with your faith. And I think that's just a mistake. You know, I think that if the kind of way of thinking about the body that I'm talking about today is accurate, then our task as Christians to look after ourselves, body, mind, and soul. The fact that we become sick in our minds isn't something that's particularly spiritual in that sense. It's something that just happens because human beings are vulnerable creatures. So I think we can get beyond that idea by getting beyond our cultural assumptions and just looking at what the Bible has to say about some of these things. Yeah.
I use that same analogy when I'm talking with athletes about the fact that when they're injured or something happens, they go to the doctor, and just thinking about the idea of seeking guidance. So if you feel lost spiritually, you go to your clergy, your pastor. If you are physically hurting, you go to a doctor. For your athletics, you have coaches and strength and conditioning coaches that are helping you. And so in all of these areas, you're okay with seeking help. But why is it for your mental health? It's something different. And talking to them, like Dr. Swinton said, about the holistic care. And about the same way when you're getting ready to have surgery, I know for me personally, I'm praying for my surgeon. I'm praying that the Lord uses his hands or her hands, use them as a vessel. And so you can and should do that same thing for your therapist. And for a good therapist, you should be able to bring your faith into the therapy session and incorporate those things.
That's good. I love your holistic approach, both of you. I'm wondering how anger and shame is used as a powerful motivator, but it's also destructive. So how might you guys see that hurting one's identity? Sports is reminding us every single day in the culture that you're only as good as your performance. And so coaches might do more negative approaches. So I can see athletes struggling with, I'm not good enough. Shame is I'm never enough, never enough. And you get on this treadmill. So how does that hurt the mental well-being of somebody?
Yeah, so after a while, you start to really internalize those things that you're hearing from coaches or other people that might be talking very negatively. And like I said, for athletes, being successful in their sport is a huge part of their identity because they see themselves as an athlete. So from a spiritual perspective, even though that's not my expertise, thinking about where your value and worth should lie and where it should come from. And then, I always have an honest conversation about, what happens after sport, because there's going to be an end one day. And so you can't put all your worth and value into this one thing. I didn't go into explaining when I talked earlier, but that last slide where there was kind of the pie chart there, it's one of the activities I do with my athletes is just having them think of that pie chart as their identity and getting a crayon and putting, this is the part of me that's an athlete, and this is the part of me, that one. This is the part of me that is a student, and this is the part of me that is whatever. And if you have something that is so great but so easily lost, then you're going to feel like there's something missing. If you have a part of you that is being hurt and it's such a large part of you, it's going to affect the rest of you. So those are just some thoughts I had about that.
No, I think that's a really good set of points, Monique. And I think the issue of value is important. And I think also that there's a connection between what goes on within your church or your religious community and what goes on within your life as an athlete or as a sports person. Because the thing is that value is always a gift. So you can't really generate value internally just by, I don't wake up one morning and say, I'm a really valuable person. It's like friendship. I don't wake up one morning and say, I'm really going to get a lot of friends today. These things are always given to you and always in a shape, they're formative. And so if you've got a context where you're not valued and you're constantly being told you're not valued, then you begin to devalue yourself, really. And I can imagine that in a sports environment, that value would be given and taken back, given and taken back. I mean, the way that you were describing the kind of ambiguities or fragility of athletes' experiences where they're really popular one day and then the next day they're really unpopular. It's only as good as your last game. That's a very difficult way to live your life and to have a stable identity. So my sense would be that there's a need for athletes, sports people, to be intentionally cared for by their religious communities, because your identity in Christ is the thing that sustains you all the way through these things. So you do have a center point, but you can very easily lose that. So there's probably scope for having intentional conversations between religious communities and sports organizations around the issue of identity and value.
That's a great segue, because I wanted to talk about a couple of questions have been trafficking around tips or strategies. So maybe if we kind of broaden that to the idea of practices. And as you've mentioned, both of you, there are certain cultural practices in sports that can be positive or they can be negative or destructive. And John, you really hit upon this emotion virtue of joy, which, interesting enough, if you didn't know this, that's kind of a signature idea of Baylor men's basketball, this culture of joy. So
is that right?
I thought we'd run with this a little bit. We would talk about what are ways to cultivate or practices to cultivate this sense of joy that might be counterculture to the way sports is thinking about happiness and kind of propping up your spirit and that kind of thing.
Well, I think one spiritual practice that would help us to refocus ourselves is prayer. Now, what I mean by that is that what do sports people pray for? Do you pray for victory, or do you pray for the right thing to happen, which happens to be victory, or do you pray for God's presence and God's blessing on what you're doing? And do you see your sport as ministry and vocation rather than simply a personal success story, career story? So I think if we begin to pray together, but in that way of recognizing God's presence, then that refocuses things. And that's a beginning point for looking differently at any kind of occasion, but certainly a sporting occasion.
That's good. So that's something even coaches can do. At a school where that's allowed. I mean, players could do that independent, of course. So that's a spiritual practice. Are there any kind of ordinary kind of practices that might, strengthen this outlook of joy? It could be spiritual, but could just be something that a coach would begin to figure out how to integrate this into even his or her regimen.
Good biblical teaching is what I was. I'm feeling like I'm a bit stereotyped here. But the thing about joy, and the way that I describe it, is it's a learned skill, because culturally we assume joy to be happiness, and we assume the goal of most of our endeavors is to keep ourselves happy, and whereas in fact nobody's ever happy for the whole of the time. So I think helping people to recognize the biblical significance of disappointment is actually something that's important, and to incorporate that into the way in which you approach issues and the way in which you make certain demands on young people, and recognizing that the way you make certain demands on young people can actually be either enhancing of their mental health or detrimental to their mental health. But doing these things intentionally, really, because I think one of the things about mental health is that people oftentimes don't speak about it, partly because of shame and partly because, there's lots of different reasons. Speak about it. Because once you start to speak about it, you'll discover that lots of people have similar experiences to you. And when that safe space opens up, assuming that safe space does, then all these other things become possible. So a practical intervention would be create spaces where people can talk about these things.
That's great.
Well, you must have read my mind, John, because we're nearing the end here, but I was wondering for both of you, we're so committed to our execution and our X's and O's, and not as intentional as leaders to create those safe spaces for vulnerability or for community or relationship development. And there's several coaches here who really make it intentional. So Monique even just mentioned the power of vulnerability and how sometimes that goes against an athlete mindset and how important that is.
Yeah. One of the best things that I've experienced is going out to talk to a particular team and a coach talking about how this particular coach had sought mental health counseling and what that vulnerability did for that team and for my caseload. But when a coach is able to talk a little bit about mental health, talk a little bit about their own struggles, talk a little bit about their own letdowns and how they recovered from that, or their own injury and how they recovered from that, it, like John says, opens up this conversation. It provides a space for vulnerability. And even if a coach is not necessarily willing to do that, I've seen even on the teams where Sports ministry addresses the team, and mental health addresses the team, and the coach is very supportive of what we're sharing. It creates a space for vulnerability. So if the coach is not themselves sharing their story, but just letting us provide education and supporting what we're doing, shows the team that they're supportive of that, and they're trying to create a space for that. Maybe it's not a direct communication with the coach, but that they support you seeking help from sports ministry and you seeking help from mental health services.
That's really good. Desmond Tutu, his fourfold path to forgiveness. I love what he says, that to name your pain and tell your story. And that alone is the beginning of even the lamenting that John mentioned. Elizabeth is going to come on in just a minute. I'm wondering if either of you have final thoughts. And I'm sorry, there's so many questions. We could go on for hours. Final thoughts that you just feel compelled you have to tell our viewers.
Well, just, I mean, at the beginning of Monique's presentation, she was talking about certain key skills that athletes have to have: perseverance, commitment, determination, passion. I think included in that would be courage. And courage means that when something goes wrong for you, when you're struggling with something, you have the courage to come forward and say, I have a problem here, somebody needs to help me. Because that's the only way that people can get fixed. So I would say that courage, obviously, as an athlete, courage is a great thing as a sports person. But in terms of mental health, I think it's fundamental.
Yeah, I think courage for coaches and parents is the courage to have this conversation, like Dr. Swinton was saying. I mean, I have seen firsthand how a coach, reads an article about a professional athlete that's struggling with mental illness and just encourages their athlete. And I can say it has saved lives, because it has been just enough for an athlete to come in and share that they're struggling in ways that nobody probably would have ever known. And so I think having that we want our athletes to have that courage, but we have to model that, and we have to show that. We have to have that vulnerability. We have to have these conversations. This idea that athletes are these superhuman people that don't deal with these struggles, we've got to change that narrative, because, and I think one of the questions that I saw asked, are athletes more or less likely to have mental illnesses? And it's the same. Like, the research we've seen so far has been pretty equal. And so even though they show you, what we get to see in the media is this person who's doing well and is thriving, what's happening underneath sometimes is very different. And so we just need to work on how we even talk about mental health, and watching our language around that, and being more courageous in our conversations.
That's a good closing point, as Elizabeth come back to the importance of language, because it does help us to see the world, and how we see the world actually affects how we live and respond to the world. So great point.